Hello, everybody. How are you? Good, good, good. It's good to see you all. Thank you for making your way on through Atlanta's marvelous weather to find yourself here. My name is Andrew Westover. I'm the Eleanor McDonald Storza Deputy Director for Learning and Civic Engagement here at the High Museum of Art. This program is in conjunction with the exhibition Ryoji Ikeda Dataverse, which was organized here at the High Museum. It was originally commissioned by Audemars Piguet Contemporary, the art program of the Swiss fine art watchmaker. The exhibition is currently on view and will close on August 10th. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to see it after today's conversation. As you're probably aware, today is UPS Second Sunday, which means the museum is free for all for the entire day. So please, if you haven't yet, head on over and check that out. At the end of the conversation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So there will, in a moment, I'll show you a QR code on the screen after we've done introductions. At any point during the conversation, you'll be able to scan that QR code and type in your question using your phone. That way, you don't have to say it perfectly into a microphone, and also you might be able to think a minute before that question pops out. So that will be coming shortly. Also want to quickly thank our donors. Our exhibition series donors, Delta Airlines, Mr. Joseph H. Boland, the Faye S. and W. Barrett Howell Family Foundation, Harry Norman Realtors, Wish Foundation, and Robin and Hilton Howell. And of course, a big thank you to the Full High team. And today's conversation is co-produced with two incredible organizations here based in Atlanta. So we have the AIAI network, and we also have the Data and Society organization, and both of them you'll hear more about momentarily. I know that you all have already seen the bios for everyone who's involved, so I won't read a long form one, but I do just want to give a little bit of a sense of who's sharing the stage with me today. So we have Professor of Quantitative Theory and Methods and English at Emory University, Lauren Klein. Researcher for Data and Society's Labor Future Programs, Anuli Akanengbu. Atlanta-based producer, DJ, cultural curator, as well as founder of High Bias, hi-fi listening event focused on jazz, soul, funk, and rare groove, and co-founder of Controlleries, if I'm saying that correctly. Correct me, what's the right way?
Controllerize.
Thank you, Controllerize, much better. Long-running weekly beat and DJ experience rooted in community and culture. Stolen Drums, also known as Chris Wilkes, and digital artist, multi-dimensional arts educator, and chief professorial officer at, oh boy, help me out here.
Your Cat Steam Labs.
Thank you, Kristen Wolford. So please join me in welcoming Lauren, Anuli, Chris, and Kristen here this afternoon. So, as promised, I am going to start briefly by discussing the Dataverse exhibition, which is part of what grounded this program here today. And I'm now going to do that glorious thing where I talk over a video, but please go ahead and watch the video while we're doing this. This exhibition is the first major US presentation of Ryoji Ikeda's work. If you're not familiar, Ryoji Ikeda is arguably the world's most famous living electronic music composer and also creates incredible visual art. What you're seeing here are renderings from our gallery of the exhibition that's currently on view. It incorporates over 20 large data sets, and they're rendered in ways that he decided to present them. Now, one thing that's unique about this exhibition, and was part of what we started talking about, is the fact that by the artist's request, there are no descriptive texts or panels anywhere in the space. Your understanding, your experience is largely based on you and your engagement with the work itself. And that sort of naturally raises some questions. So what we're going to do now is use that as a jumping off point for this conversation. And because Dataverse removes this larger set of metadata, perhaps, like citations or explanations, viewers get offered movement. Viewers get offered sound. Viewers get often offered form in ways that could be captivating or could be a little bit disorienting. So let's begin with this question about context. I want to start with you, Lauren, because you work both in data science and the humanities centers on reintroducing context to overlooked histories. And I know many of us are familiar with history singular, some of us are familiar with histories plural, and then thinking about overlooked histories plural already gives us a lot to work with. How do you see the role of interpretive context in recovering meaning from data? Just a tiny question to start us off.
Just a small one. Well, thank you. Thank you, Andrew and Mikala, and also Anuli, who really masterminded this entire panel, and to CJ Data and Society, and everyone really for being here. It's amazing to see so many people here in the audience who are all interested in context, which to me is everything. So I guess that's the short answer to your question, which is that I see it as fundamental to understanding what it is that we're looking at and why. But I think, one of the things that struck me when I saw the Ryoji exhibit a long time ago was, and I actually didn't even realize that the lack of context was there on purpose. I want to know immediately what it was that I was looking at, because my work is about trying to sort of poke holes through what, in the context of data visualization, people describe as, it's called the God trick. This idea that when you're looking at a data visualization, it seems like it was created by no one, it's coming from nowhere, it's presenting this objective, neutral, godlike view. But it's a trick, right? Because it's always created by people. And part of how you get at what it is you're really looking at is by understanding the context surrounding it. So for me, that's really important so that I can know what it is. I was like, what are these data sets? Some are numbers, some are brain scans, some look like military targeting operations, and why are they all together? And why do we not know why they're all together? What are we supposed to think? So I'm really glad that we have this panel to think through some of these ideas.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a really interesting piece, I think, this idea of playing with data sets that are clearly observable data of some kind and wrestling with what then does this mean? And I think that relates directly to your work, Anuli, when you're thinking about data from a particular perspective. In your work at Data and Society, I know you work across a couple of domains. You're thinking about labor, you're thinking about race, you're thinking about technology. And what happens when some of these contexts are either removed or obscured when we're thinking about data? So I'm wondering if you could talk with us about when we use data and we're building technologies or engaging with technologies and there's context that's erased, what does that mean and where does that leave us?
I mean, to Lauren's point, context is everything, right? I come into my work from a background in cultural anthropology. So when you're an anthropologist, you have to be in a community, in the space, and being in a space helps you really understand a lot of nuances. So when those type of cultural markers are erased, then you're essentially erasing the space. A lot of times in Black arts, we always talk about culture is the context to which people understand and navigate the world. When you remove the context from that, you tend to remove the culture. So when you have communities that are erased, you are leaving a lot of stories untold. I feel like you have less of a true, full knowledge of the world around you without those stories, without that context. We're even thinking about something like the history of rock and roll, for example, and you had Sister Rosetta Tharpe, whose legacy was left out of that for years. So we thought the context was that someone like Elvis Presley created rock and roll. Now we know that is not true. A lot of that came from Black gospel music. So when we put that context back in, we have a fuller understanding of how something came to be. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I want to continue down the line maybe with just the core of this question, which is, how do you think about context? And I know for each of you as artists and makers in your own ways, maybe we'll start with you, Kristen.
Okay, yeah. For me, context is, I guess it can be slippery. It can be on a spectrum. My work does a lot of remixing, coming from a tradition of hip hop. So I'm constantly thinking about reimagining context or even, collapsing contexts that don't usually go together to make you feel uncomfortable, or, mixing context and blurring the lines of maybe what your expectation was for the context of the visual versus the other layers that is surrounded by. So depending on, I guess, the piece or what I'm trying to communicate, I may have everything, the context, kind of properly line up and maybe get more intense or more chill and mellow, or it may be very extreme, radically different context. So I like to play with it.
I love it. I think play is an important word that I'd love to resurface here, because I do think that's something that in conversations about data, it can very quickly become about the head or about cognition, and to remember that also we have bodies, and when we're experiencing these things, it's all of us. Which leads me to thinking about your work. You're working often with sound, and you're thinking about the space that it inhabits. What does context look like for you?
Yeah, so for us and the work that we do with putting together events and playing music for folks, context for us is one of those things that almost we can manipulate. And say, like, my ideology coming into a DJ mix may be to illustrate somebody's work or the influence that somebody's work had on a body of music or a genre or time. But somebody in the room listening to that same mix may take away, I just enjoy the vibe here, or I just enjoy this feeling. And being aware of that gives me the ability to kind of play in both worlds. And so, to me, context is one of those things that is very, kind of foundational to how I approach something. But I also have to take into account, the different perspectives that people may have in receiving it. So it's one of those things that kind of gives me, I guess, insight on how to build, really everything that I'm doing. Yeah.
Absolutely. So now I'm going to put on the screen this little QR code that I promised earlier. So if you haven't yet, go ahead, take out your phone, use this QR code to go to the website, where it will allow you to type in any questions you have. Can be about the topic, can be for any individual person, and at the end of this conversation, we will absolutely go straight there. And I'd like now to think about feedback loops. So when we're thinking about data and context, each of you in your own ways, I think about what feedback you are going to engage with and what feedback maybe you're not. So anyone who'd like to take a stab at, when you're thinking about feedback, how do you begin to discern what am I going to pull forward and what am I going to step away from?
All right, I'll tell you. Yeah. So for me, feedback. I guess I kind of look at the energy. Even if it's good feedback, bad feedback, however you want to qualitate it. I always try to have a certain energy that comes across. And then in my actual pieces, I do like to have live video feeds so that the feedback, I don't really have anything to do with it necessarily, your feedback or your contribution to the pieces, whatever you're doing, just make space for you to do that. So I tend to try to have a little bit of separation and not be necessarily too influenced, but at the same time, I want direct feedback in some of my work. Not sure if that really answers the question, but it's just kind of the things that I kind of think about when it comes to feedback loops, and that kind of thing.
I can jump in as well. In my work, there's multiple levels of feedback, and I may get some financial feedback, right? If I make terrible decisions repeatedly, then my bottom line is affected. And I may get feedback from press and feedback from certain people, and what happens is there's this nuance, certain things I know will generate a response, and some things won't to the majority, but they're important to the work. And so you kind of have to pick and choose what's the most important. Is this a slow burn type of situation, and where there's a delayed gratification type of situation happening, and where I may end up at the High Museum speaking about some work that I'm doing because it's important, versus I can get everybody really excited right now by playing whatever's cool on TikTok, or doing something that would be a little easier for folks to digest. and kind of towing that line. So we're looking at, like, as a company, we're looking at like what pieces of feedback are the most important for us. And you can't keep everybody happy all of the time, but like what's mission essential and what's essential to reputation, and then how do we, after taking care of those things, make sure people have a good time. So yeah, that's how we look at feedback.
I will say for me, so as Andrew shared previously, I study labor, race, and technology. But again, I do that through the lens of cultural anthropology. So for me, feedback is in my everyday interactions with people. So I came to Atlanta for my dissertation research project some years ago, and that was focused on like Black creatives here in the city. And that work doesn't stop. There's not a 9 to 5 through my approach to research because it's very community oriented. I get data everywhere. I could be talking to a Lyft driver. I could be at an art event. I could be at the High Museum. I could be at the grocery store. I'm always getting in more data inputs and feedback from other people. And I think one thing that makes at least my approach to technology research different than maybe other technology scholars is that I do a lot of primary research, right? And that primary research is done with people. So I'm always hearing other people's perspectives, getting their feedback, and kind of iterating my thoughts, my approach based off of that, right? Because ultimately what I do is I talk to people and I learn about their perspectives and I try to make sense of these patterns across these stories, right? So for me, the feedback is what kind of builds the work. It's not something you can read in a book. It's not something that you can get from a secondary source. This research that I do stands out because it comes from the feedback of others. It comes from their perspectives, and what I do is try to make sense of seemingly disparate perspectives or seemingly disparate things, and then bring that together. But I find that I have, in a way, accountability because my work is so community oriented. I care so much about the people of Atlanta because they've welcomed me into the city to do this work. So those are the people that I hold, like, if you think the work is good, then I'm great with it, right? Like, I don't really look as much to like academia to like validate my work. I look to the people, I look to the feedback. I try to write in a way, for example, that anyone can read it. That my Gen Z sister or my mom or anyone even older than that, any generation can read the work, because I want it to be able for people to actually like receive this data and then kind of interpret it for themselves, share with me what they think about it. Like, so there's always a feedback loop. It's like I'm always collecting data just in my everyday life, and I'm like kind of never not working, and I filter that through like other contexts, maybe secondary information. One of the things I did when I first moved to Atlanta, to get a feel of the city, you have to drive, sure, but I also rode my bike around different neighborhoods, because then you experience it different when you realize that some sidewalks are not fully paved, and this is not necessarily a walk-in city, right? You learn the city by the different modes of interpretation or the different modes of experience, and that adds to the feedback and how I reiterate my perception of it as well. So feedback is always happening, and my own self-filtering is always happening.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add and say all of your responses are, I think, incredibly revealing, right? Chris, you're talking about the feedback you get from a room. Kristen, you're talking about the literal feedback of filming your audience and incorporating back into the video. And really, you're talking about the people you talk to and validate and sort of hold you accountable and your output. And I think, for me, as someone who works with data, those feedback mechanisms are not a given. It needs to be a choice. And I think one of the reasons sort of coming to this exhibition and seeing the show, it really sort of stopped me in my tracks, because I couldn't tell if the lack of context was supposed to be, it was intended to get us asking those questions, like where are the people, where is the context, what don't we know? Or if it was intended to be interpreted as this purely aestheticized experience, in which case, to be honest, I had a lot of problems with that, because this is something that I intentionally choose to do in my work, which is, even though I don't have to, I want to know who the people are who went into the making of the data, who are the people who collected it, who are the people who are counted, who are the people who are not counted, right? But that is not the default in data science. Which is why I feel like this show is really thought-provoking in that regard.
It might add to that, one of the things that even inspired this program for me was going through the show myself, and there's a part, like, when you first enter, there's a light shining at a wall. And I didn't know how to engage with it. Because usually when you go to an exhibit, you see something like that. Is it for me to stand in front of it? Is it for me to, like, what is this space? So I had stepped in front of the light, right? Because I'm like, oh, maybe this is like an interactive thing. And then the security guard was like, oh, no, don't do that. And I was like, well, there's no tape, because you're used to certain things at a museum that helps you navigate that space or tells you how to engage with that space. So there's no tape, there's no description on the wall. And then that's when the security guard told me, oh, the artist made that choice on purpose. He didn't want any tape on the wall, on the floors. He didn't want a description. And if the security guard didn't tell me that, I would not know that that was intentional, right? I would not know how to engage with the space. And I find, like, when we lack that context, we try to fill in the gaps ourselves, right? Like, I'm trying to stand in front and be like, what is the thing I'm supposed to do here? And it made me think about, what does it mean to have that context? Like, if I knew where the data came from that informed what was on the screens in the exhibit, what would that do for me? Is it good to not have that knowledge? Is ignorance truly bliss? Or do I need that to more deeply engage with the space? And I think that is what Ikeda is challenging us to think about. Like, how much information do we need to know to engage with something? Oftentimes, you need context because it helps you understand why things are the way it is. But is there a setting when, like this exhibit, where you may not need that to fully engage? And then what do we do when we don't have that? We start to fill in that space ourselves and try to think about what it means to us. Or when I went back earlier today, people are like taking pictures, and I wonder what everyone is thinking about. And I would love to hear the audience questions, like what everyone is thinking about when they're taking pictures of these things, and what does it mean to them beyond the aesthetics of it? Is there a deeper connection you're having to the show? And if you don't have that deep connection, is it because the context isn't there? So that really kind of started this conversation. For me, it was like, wait, how much do I need to know in order to appreciate something?
Kristen, I'm going to pick on you a little bit because as a visual artist on the panel, I think this is something that you very clearly have to wrestle with, right? Of determining how much context are you going to give the viewer when they're engaging with your visual work. How do you negotiate that?
Yeah, I would say I think that, like, not having the context is the invitation, is the, like, conversation that's going to happen, is, it's like what is that? The person that you're standing next to, you may have the conversation, you may learn something, so I'm talking about, like, the play, that idea of it, like, being kind of like a fun thing, like, wayfinding your way through a visual piece is like a fun experiment to me, and that's what I try to create, I guess. A lot of people will walk up to my work, and there are people that hate it. It's like, what? Like, it's too much. Like, what is going on, man? Like, way too much. And other people, I expect it a little bit. Like, for some people, like, absolutely. Like, this is not what you're used to seeing. I kind of know that up front. But and then there are other people that it may catch their eye. They're walking by. They maybe don't want to spend that much time with it because they don't really know what it is. They don't know if they're supposed to be looking at it. A lot of different reactions. And some people will, one thing, and then that leads to another thing and another thing, and then they kind of get sucked into the piece. So that's kind of how I see things. Sometimes I imagine somebody won't spend much time, and so maybe I won't make it as complex and as layered. And other times it's like, no, spend some time with this piece, like, fully immerse yourself. Give me 15 minutes of you just trying to figure out what is going on here, and thinking about, okay, that context of that the image from that archive may not really match this one, and so on and so forth. Kind of try to create like little rabbit holes almost of visuals.
That's something that I really appreciate about your work, and I tossed up just one image, but that when I've encountered your work, what I've often seen is that you've constructed it in such a way that it sort of rewards whatever people are willing to give it. That you can engage on a very surface level, perhaps, or just a quick level, and still get something from it, or you can spend some time and start to see some of these layers and start to, in the ones that have, for example, the feedback loops you were talking about, see yourself, question your own relationship with the work. Like, I think that layering is so helpful and pushes the viewer forward in useful ways. And Chris, I want to toss that to you too, because I think that in your spaces that you're creating, sometimes people get it and they're with you, and sometimes people don't. And often that's about context, right? Like, are they getting the context or are they not? So I'm wondering if I flip the question on its head and ask you about if you've curated the space, you've got the music going, it's the music you chose, it's the sound system, it's the room, but there's people who are just not getting it. What do you do? Or how do you think about that?
I mean, in a sense, like there's a certain level of that being important. I think it's important not to understand everything at first glance, right? And so this gives you an opportunity to kind of like find and I think that's really important, right? I got some room to explore or to kind of navigate, and I found a new thing, or I realized what this was about halfway through it. The fourth song about rain during this this set of music, I just realized it was raining outside. Oh, this is contextual. They did that on purpose. Wow, Or I'm eating pizza and, after a half hour in, like all of these artists are Italian. Oh, that's crazy, right? And so I think it's important to have that layered, kind of ability for people to experience the surface and then kind of navigate their way to deeper levels. And I think it's also important not to give people everything up front, right? And so, like, if I know everything there is to know about this piece at first glance, then why am I looking at it, really, right? And so if I have some nuance and some ability to kind of form my own opinion or really, kind of take away my own feeling or inject some of myself in it, I think that makes it great. So I think having that bit of, that lack of transparency almost, a little bit of it anyway, is really important, yeah.
Lauren, academics are generally not known for communicating clearly. Part of why you're on the panel is because you do communicate clearly, and we're grateful for it. But I'm wondering, as we're thinking about hearing how folks are engaging with context, oftentimes when academics are presenting work, it's very straightforward, it's very logical. There's not a lot of find your own journey. There's a lot of part 1A, part 2C. How do you think about what should be given to people? Is there room for player exploration? How do you negotiate context?
I feel so seen. Because I'm hearing the three of you describe your experience in the exhibition, and I'm hearing my critiques of it and realizing that was 100% my expectation, was that as someone who works with data and thinks a lot about where data comes from and what the ethics are of bringing one data set in relationship to another data set, those are all questions that I want answered up front, because if they haven't been answered, my presumption is the person has not thought about it, right? Because the convention of the discipline is that you are supposed to tell people about your choices, right? Whereas if you're in a room, if you're walking by artwork, if you've chosen to go to a museum, you want to be thinking as you're going through, right? And you don't want it spelled out exactly what you're supposed to think before you see it. So I think you're right. I mean, I think you've really identified something. But the one thing I will say, so I say, on the one hand, I do believe all that. The other thing that I will say, looking at exhibition like this in the year 2025, when we are living in a world that has been in many ways fundamentally shifted because of a handful of people who took all the data in the world and did not think about context before they decided to put it into their AI systems and take it away from artists and use it to fire people in the federal government. I think that universal context, because it's not just in the US, even though we're the epicenter, it is impacting people everywhere in the world. I personally think that context needs to be acknowledged, because there is a concern that if you arbitrarily, and I'm intentionally being a little bit provocative here, so feel free to disagree, but I do think there's a concern that if you put military targeting data next to stock prices, next to brain scans, and you don't say, think about the fact that all of these were incorporated into the show because they're available on the web and anyone can take them. Ikeda did not pay for them. He just put them together and they look nice. I think we all now need to learn how to think harder about that. And so to me, that's something that I think maybe has changed even from the context in which Ikeda created the work and how sort of the time when it was installed at the high right now for us.
Yeah, I'll hop in there with a little bit that I think you're right. These data sets ask very real moral and ethical questions if you think about them for a couple of minutes. And one thing that's interesting with this exhibition is Ryoji Ikeda, we talked about him being an electronic music composer, we talked about him being a visual artist. Well, what we didn't mention yet is that he also has been artist in residence with many different organizations. So over the past 20 years, he's had residencies with NASA, CERN, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, some really massive institutions. And in these residencies, what he says is his goal is to be in a position where he can, for himself, have a degree of understanding of the data so that when he presents it, it is true enough in its representation of the data. I'll say that again. So a degree of understanding of the data so that in his presentation of it, it is true enough in its representation of the data. Which is one way of thinking about it, right? Because it's sort of saying whatever the data is, and now I'm reading onto his work, it's almost as though he's saying, you could make ethical claims about it, but I'm going to try not to. Instead, I'm going to present it and consider it aesthetically and sonically and create an experience around it. But Anuli, when you are thinking about data, I imagine you often are thinking from a different perspective, right? Where you're really primarily considering what are the ethical implications of the data? Are there moral questions we should be wrestling with, whatever the data? How did you come to allow that to be your orientation to thinking about data?
That's a big question, but I also, before I answer it, I'm like, my brain is buzzing thinking about this added context you provided about the show, because I didn't know how Ikeda got access to the data, right? So now knowing that background of like he was embedded in these organizations which gave him access to this massive amount of data, makes me want to connect that to the previous question about like academia as well, because we use the word context in this conversation quite a bit, but another word we can include is abstraction, right? And one of the ways that like academic work can seem a little abstract to the everyday person is because of the use of like jargon, these big words, and you wonder, does this person really know what they're saying, or are they trying to be intentionally obtuse so I don't understand it? And I wonder, like, if Ikeda knows, the data and what it means, and then he shares it to us in this more abstract way, like, it makes me think of something similar, right? What does this abstraction do, right? What does the flattening of the data mean for us? Like, he knows all the interesting things behind it, but then if we have, like, abstraction, I think sometimes, and we see this in politics all the time, like a politician just may say something that sounds good, but you really don't know what they're saying. Like they're using abstraction as a way to kind of derive power because you don't know what they know, and they're presenting it to you in a way that's like, it could mean this, it could mean that, it's open to interpretation, but they'll never get caught holding the bag because they said just enough that we can't like point the finger. So I think when we talk about context, a lot of it is like abstraction of like understanding what it is that we are seeing and doing. Like when I went to the show, the next exhibit I went to after Dataverse was one that was more abstractionist art, and you had, local artists like Hassani Salihi's work, and it's still like very minimalist, right? It's still very abstract, but there's a context there. Like that bold use of color, like I know from the description, right? He's from Caribbean. And that culture has a very bold use of color. They use color in this expressive way. So like even though the work was minimalist and very abstract, right? Like I knew the context in which to engage with it. I knew his why. So now like hearing like kind of Ikeda's why and how, it makes me want to go back and look at the show again, right? What does he mean that he got this mass, this access to this data, and why did he make these choices to present it to us in these certain ways, like that he has a context that we don't? Makes me, not saying that he's doing this, but it makes me think about power dynamics in everyday life, where people know something that you don't, but that thing might inform how you engage with it, how you navigate that space.
Yeah, I think a real through line of the exhibition and this conversation is the question of power. To have data in this society, in many ways, is to have forms of power. To use data is to enact power in certain ways. This is for anyone who wants to leap. I'm interested in how you think about the relationship between the data you engage, whether it be human, algorithmic, whether it's something that you build or something that you have access to or that you're seeing in the world. How do you think about power in your engagement with data?
I mean, I probably couldn't answer that other question that you asked through it, so that goes with the ethics, right? Like, I think it's important as researchers that, like, we say that the work is objective, but it can't be, right? Because it is informed by how we are situated in the world, right? Like, the lens through which I see the world is informed by these different aspects of my identity, whether it's my gender, whether it's like my cultural upbringing, the state that I grew up, the month I was born. All these things inform how I see the world. And I think that because I'm a Black woman, I'm particularly primed to kind of really see power dynamics in a particular way, or to think about, community towards like a sensibility of like morale and ethics, wanted to do right by my community, wanted to do right by my gender, all these different aspects of my community. I remember some months ago, I went to a workshop and it was all economists in the room, and I'm like the lone anthropologist. And I remember they were talking, it was like an AI and labor workshop, and the person next to me, he said, "Oh, you know what I love about AI? I can ask it a question to give me a different perspective." And his identity was like a white man. He was like, "I can use it to give me like different cultural perspectives," and I'm here next to him like, or you could just talk to people, right? Like, you can just ask somebody else, but like the fact that was like his approach, like, let me use the technology to learn about people without actually engaging with people, is something we see a lot in the world of tech. Things are being created that they purport to be for our good, but they never ask one person if this is what they need in their life. As an anthropologist, I'm always talking to people, right? My feedback loop is always being refined through those conversations with people, because that is what separates my discipline from other disciplines. You have secondary research, but it's really the primary that makes anthropology different. It's really being embedded in the community. I can't do a study on Atlanta from New York. Even though I went to NYU, I had to come here, I had to move here, I had to be embedded in the community, and now because I am embedded, I have like a different ethical compass than maybe somebody that might be studying Atlanta, but they don't live here, right?
Chris, it looked like you were about to say something when we were thinking about power and data.
Yeah, that was a great response, first and foremost. Also, this is terrible, but I've been watching Invincible. I don't know if you guys have seen Invincible. It's a cartoon. It's on Amazon. It's great. It's about superheroes that get powers, and how like the real life implications of superheroes in the regular world work. And yeah, it's really gory and it's wild. It's also really well written. Anyway, this guy wants powers and he doesn't have them yet. He's a kid. He's grown up. His dad's a superhero, or his dad's super powered, and he doesn't have his powers, and he really wants them, and then he gets them, and he has to use them, and like, wow, it wasn't what he expected, right? And so like with great power comes great responsibility, and I think about like the parallel between us and being on the internet, on social media, and having access to all of the things all of the time. It's like we have like a nuclear weapon in our hands, basically, that we didn't really ask for it, but we just have it now. It's like, oh yeah, my car can do 500 miles an hour, if I wanted to, unprovoked, right? Like I wasn't. I was just driving a Yugo last week, and now I can do 500 miles an hour, and we are participating in really what I consider to be like, some kind of substantial change in how society works, and every interaction that we have with the platforms. This is all coming from this conversation, by the way. But with every interaction that we're having with the platforms, we're either informing or fueling or you know, kind of like building upon this thing that's already happening, this phenomenon. And it's like we low-key have a really large responsibility to do the right thing here, but I don't think we think about it too much, and we probably should think about it more. That's what I was going to say.
I'm wondering, Lauren, if you have any disciplinary divisions between sort of the presentation Anuli's given. So Anuli's talking about anthropology, right, as a discipline, that it's rooted in place, it's rooted in conversation, it's rooted in people. And my understanding is you're housed in English and that you're dealing with large language data sets, yes? Sorry, I'm the moderator, not the expert, in case you can't tell. And I understand that that doesn't always have the same sense of being as connected with people. So how do you negotiate with power?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I think there's a real divide in the field, I think, as there is in the world right now, between the people of which, you know, I am one, who say, even though this data is large, it still comes from people, and the best way to understand it is by talking to people, because from that, you recognize that just because it's really big doesn't mean that it's everything, right? And you still know that there are individuals and communities that are left out of this data. And then there's people who say, like, it's good enough, you know? And there's people who like working in this space because they can ask they don't need to talk to people. They can ask the AI instead, right? And I think that we're at a moment right now where it's important to call out those distinctions, because decisions are being made by individuals who may not be predisposed either by inclination or politics to want to talk to the people who very fundamentally contributed to the data or the substrate of their work. So I think, you know, for me, it's very, very important. I think it's a flaw in it's certainly in computational research, but arguably in historical research, which is mostly sort of where the background that I came from, because people also like old things because those people aren't around anymore, right? You can't talk to them because the book that was written was, you know, 200 years ago or whatever. But you do need to recognize that, in my view, again, the best, most informed, most contextualized work comes from people who recognize that those works are coming from a community, that you can learn about them by placing them back in that community and by following their afterlives into the present. To me, that's where you get the richest and most informed and more meaningful knowledge for the present. But I don't think that's a universal view, you know? So part of the goal that I have as a scholar is to do the work well enough to communicate it, to your point, clearly enough that people come away with the belief that that is the better way to do the work that we do, and that the work that does not acknowledge people and context and politics is lesser because it's missing large chunks of the knowledge that it claims to bring to light, right?
My last question is going to be partly a provocation, and it comes from the artist himself, from Ryoji Ikeda. So Ikeda doesn't allow people to take photos of him, ever. So you can try to Google, good luck, you'll probably find a silhouette of him in front of a very bright screen. But one of the things he has said is that he seeks to compose music, I can just feel that there will be some bristles to this, to compose music free from cultural associations and as transparent and universal as mathematical equations. So that one more time. This is music specifically, not necessarily the visual art, but he seeks to compose music free from cultural associations and as transparent and universal as mathematical equations. Ikeda was born and raised in Japan, now lives between Tokyo and Paris and sometimes the US. He has this sort of life that some of us have seen on the internet, or maybe some of you have, where it's just like living between places, being with people who share some sets of values, but sort of seeing himself as untethered from a specific nationality, per se. And I think in some ways, this is a very different perspective than any of the perspectives that have been shared on this stage. So since you all have both shared your own perspective and now heard a little more about this artist that we're all thinking loosely about, I'd like to hear from you when you encounter something like this where there's some friction between how you hold meaning making and how someone else is making meaning. What do you then do?
I jump in. I deal with this in many places, right? And I have my own set of motivations for creating in all of the work that I do. And I have, partners and business people that work around me, and they have very different motivations. And sometimes we're on the opposite end of the spectrum. And so the first thing I try and do is put myself in the shoes of this person that has the opposite opinion of me. And so when I think about somebody that is a composer first, not a producer, and somebody that's making it's a high level of art, something that may be shown in a museum, or that's kind of not necessarily with the people in a way. It's like, given the information that I got, right, given the data that you served me, attracts, right? That's definitely not my reality, but it's okay. We can have two different ones, right? So, that's kind of how I would look at this. I come from a completely different background, for sure. But yeah, dude, if you got, if you jet set all over the planet and you live on the top floor of some giant sky rise in a couple different cities, and your friend circle is multinational, and it tracks. I can see how you got there. Yeah.
I'm like laughing inside because I'm like, must be nice, right? Like, I don't have the privilege or the choice to not be perceived. Like, I could just stand in a space without saying anything and somebody's going to try to fill in the gaps, right? I think that approach he has is interesting to me because, like I said, I don't think it's possible to be objective as anybody. Like, he, in his work, is still making intentional choices about, like, our experience in the space, right? Like, how we see it, the scale in which we see it, the ways in which we, like, work around it. Like, I don't think a human being of any kind can, like, lean into any work with objectivity. We might try to, right? But there's still going to be something like a fingerprint, our own fingerprint in that work. So it is very interesting to see, like, that is his approach to it. And part of it, I think, goes back to the conversation around power, because he is able to afford the life through maybe his partnerships with these different institutions, that he can live a semi-recluse life where he can come and engage with the world as he sees fit, where a lot of us don't have that privilege, right? Like, we are not able to navigate the world without being perceived, even on the days when we would just like to, like, go to the store and not have anyone talk to us, right? Especially when you add into, like, gender-wise, as a woman walking down the street, you're always being perceived. I was driving down here today and someone was honking their car at me often, and I was like, what is going on? I rolled down the window and he's trying to spit game at me. I said, I just don't want to be perceived. I'm trying to get to the High Museum. So, like, I don't have to, like, I just really, like, reflecting on that in my head, because some of us are able to pretend like we can be objective, and others, like myself, I can't even imagine what it's like to pretend to be objective. And even when you talk about something being mathematical, math is not objective. Like, math came from Africa, but we don't talk about that history, right? We think of math as, like, this sanitized thing that just came out of, like, nowhere, but it's still rooted in place, and in the ways that it's used is still rooted in different communities, how we even use math. That's why quant data isn't as objective as people think it is, right? Because someone chose how to interpret that data, and their way of choosing how to interpret that data is just based off of their life and their experiences. But you can I used to work in marketing, you could take a stat and make it mean one thing that might not be what it actually means. Like, that's marketing, that's framing, that's packaging, and framing is everything.
There we go. I'm going to turn to the questions that you all are submitting. And a reminder again, if you have a question that's burning within you that you'd like to share, please go ahead and use the QR code to share. This one is from Anonymous. In today's digital world, this is really helpful, I think, because we've mostly talked about data in the sense that we're believing it to be trustworthy to some degree. And this question is saying, how do you discern what's real versus what is generative or iterative so you're able to add or expound as opposed to something that creates digital noise? And so my own 2 cents on the end of that, just as I think about my own social feeds that are now full of, last night it was AI Britney Spears singing songs she has definitely never sung. And I was legitimately confused as to how am I moving forward, going to know the difference between the songs she's singing and the songs that have been generated or iterated. So to this question, how do each of you think about discerning what's real versus what's generated? And how do you think about what's generative and what's noise?
I can jump in. This is really interesting. I got invited about a year ago to artist retreat, and all these artists that I look up to, a lot of these geniuses, kind of from my space and culture, were there, and we were making music together and hanging out. It was amazing. One of the fellas that was there was a representative from one of these companies, from these AI companies that make music, and these generative AI companies, and I got angry at this guy. It was just out of my character. I'm not this type of dude. But he was making generative AI music of some of my heroes, but it was terrible, right? And, and like some of my heroes are here, and I could see that they were uncomfortable, so I'm mad, bro. I'm like, turn it off, bro. Like, Anyway, what I think very quickly is happening is, and this is unfortunate, there is no discernment between the two. Right, I think that's not going to be a thing in the very short future. There won't be a discernment, and it all exists as data, and you have to choose how you engage in general with stuff versus being able to pick out what's real and what isn't. Because honestly, none of it is. This is crazy. Because if you turn on your camera and you kind of record a moment, you manufactured it, and so. Yeah, it's just right now stuff. I'm just kind of like, right? Like, if it's on Instagram, it's hard for that to be real, right? What is real even? So yeah, it's just like, how do you want to engage with content in general? Can you take away something that's important to you that helps you out with what you're doing and kind of leave the rest for somebody else? Yeah, I think that's where I'm landing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, especially dealing with the visual, I mean, last night, I literally spent like 7 hours updating my knowledge of like what is possible with video AI, and just seeing like, okay, I mean, I know I paid attention to this a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, and I try to keep up or whatever, but yeah, I mean, the AI is pretty intense. Like the things that you can do with it are pretty what was it, the uncanny valley or something like that with like video games, and it's like, how close can you get to reality? Like some of the stuff out there is, you would not know the difference, right? You get deep fakes, like all kind of stuff that people are doing. So there's definitely, you're talking about like trust in data, like, being able to honestly, to even just trust the visual that you're seeing is becoming harder and harder to do. With that being said, I do look at the tools to see like, okay, well, beyond just trying to like fake reality, like, okay, well, what are some other interesting doors that this might be able to open? It's like, I feel like every other day I'm like just swirling around thinking about video and AI and like where things are going and all that kind of stuff. And it is concerning, I would say, to say the least. But it does also open, possibilities for the type of stuff that I do. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's just like the kind of things that are on my mind when I think about that. And generative work, it's like, do people even care anymore? I mean, I don't know. I do try to. It's intangible, but I try to always put like some of my soul into the work. And AI doesn't. I'm not trying to get too off on a tangent, but it doesn't have a soul, right? Like, what are the things that we have that, the AI cannot reproduce? It has an idea of what emotion is, but does it like really know? It's like that kind of thing. And then like how you like do the vinyls, right? Like it's like you feel the sound from the vinyls versus that like crisp, stereo speakers. So I don't know. It's like you can mix them. You can be a purist. At one moment, I thought it was very important for if people were making AI films that should be like its own genre or category, and you just state it up front, and then just strap in. Like I know I'm going on this fake ride or whatever, and that's fine. Do it with anime, do it with AI. Like I said, if you want to be a purist, get some film strips and make a film, So, I don't know.
Yeah, sure. It's making me think. I've been trying to remember that. What's this band on Spotify last week? The band that the people at Google made. What's that name? So there's this band like a week ago. Maybe the whole lifespan of this whole arc is maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, where a band no one knew what they were about rose to the top of the Spotify most played playlist, and people thought it was an AI band. They kept on trying to be like, show us pictures of yourself, and they would release pictures of like the guitar player with 6 fingers, things like this. And I kept on saying, like, actually AI is better than that at this point, that it doesn't make pictures of 6-fingered guitar players anymore. The music was like kind of okay, it was, people like listening to it, right? And in the end, it was revealed that it was 2 guys at Google who were effing with the Spotify listeners because they were trying to convince them that what they were listening to was AI, but they thought they could pretend to be an AI. It had many, many, many layers. But, the thing that it got me thinking about was, the conversation around it. This band was not that interesting until the question of whether or not it was AI or not became the question in play. It didn't get interesting until they started releasing photos, until in the comments section, the band was interacting with the users who were asking for more information. They were trying to replicate AI voice or whatever, which, on its own was pretty interesting. But the takeaway from that is that it was not interesting until real human people, started interacting with it. And they made this question of, is it AI or not, the question that they were discussing. But in the end, it wasn't even, that was sort of the pretext for this larger community coalescing around truth-finding and fact-finding and trying to decide why it was that they liked it so much, which in the end takes me back to the communities around music and art making, who are the ones who sort of keep it going, right? I think back to, like in the 1950s, 60s, 70s even, there was a sort of history of theory about the simulacrum, this idea that we could all live in these universal cities that all looked the same, that had all the same features, that it didn't matter where you were in the world because the experience of walking through them was the same. And what was upsetting in the people who had called this out was that the objects were all the same, right? No matter where you went in the world. But the difference always is the people walking around through them, right? It's the people who are interacting with these objects that make it meaningful. And so this question, I think of what's true, what's fake, how do we engage with something that comes from AI versus something that comes from people? In the end, what it comes back to, and I think what the sort of the correction and the salvation is in the communities that we form around these works, whether they are being this is not real. We're here to tell you that this is not real, what you are looking at. Or the people who say, we don't know if this is real, but we like talking about it, right? In both cases, those are people interacting with the artwork through a venue that allows that interaction, that I think is what sort of keeps us going. And I think the biggest concern to me would be the closing off of any ability to have conversation about what it is that we are being presented with, right? If you're not allowed to say, I don't think this is real, or I don't think this was made by a person, right? We need to be able to have those conversations with other people in order to keep our own ability to make meaning and make truth alive.
I want to leap on that because there's a little bit of back and forth happening on the questions, which is great, where one person said, you know, that quote about this artist actually discourages my interest in the exhibit. Someone else said, well, I think that quote represents his ignorance. And someone else says, these are all responses to the questions, so thank you for having a conversation in the questions. And someone else says, at the same time, claiming objectivity offers ways to react personally and culturally and speculate about the artist. And so first, I should apologize to Ryoji Ikeda. Ryoji, I'm not trying to throw you under the bus. Two, I think part of what I like about this is it does point us to some very real questions about how do we discern what's true, right? Because I think in visual art right now, there are many people who would say that truth comes from the context of the maker. And there are many people alongside them who would say that can reveal, but that can also obscure. And I think if you talk to Ryoji, he is not a flippant fly-by-night guy. He's very much someone who's like deeply steeped in music communities, which often are combinations of people who have been excluded from wherever else, especially in these electronic scenes that he grew up in and helped form. And now I'm reading onto him again, but in the brief conversation I had with him, one of the things he was talking about was, for me, this making was so much about us being together and building this world together. And that was the thing that drove us forward. That there is something ultimately, and I think this goes to your point and several of the points that have been made, if data doesn't come back around to recognizing humanity or understanding the we part of data, then I think it does swim in these eddies that you're pointing out, like the overlords who are collecting and amassing, the people who are denying the context, the people who say that's not me, or I'm not interested, or I'm not going to engage, versus the ones who say, I may not get it, it may not be for me, I may disagree, but when the human is still involved in the context and the data, that's where there's something really, really fruitful and powerful. Again, please take any of Andrew's moral readings as separate from what the artist is doing. But I did want to circle around to give him a little bit of a redemption arc. I also wanted to ask, we've got just a couple minutes left. So as people are about to head out, for each of you, we've thought for this hour about data, about context. What would you say is your parting word or gift or question for folks who are really still thinking about data and context?
I would say, and I think this is an answer to the question, how do you determine if something's real or not? I think when it comes to data, like as a researcher, if you see something, you're like, I don't know if this makes sense. What do? You go back to the source material. So if you see something online and you're like, I don't know why Britney Spears is singing this song, it doesn't seem like her. Well, where are you getting this information from? Like, what is the source of this information? So I think that is one way in this like more AI-driven world is we got to go back to the source material. Who is sharing this information? Why are they sharing this information with us? Why now? Like, we have to ask ourselves questions as we engage with anything in this world. So always be curious. I would lean with that. And anything that you do in any aspect of your life, lean into curiosity, ask questions. Even if you want to bite your tongue, don't. Even if you decide, oh, it's not a big deal, it might be. So if you want to determine if something's real or not, just find, go where it is, like find the source material. But at the same time, I will kind of like say that for many people, like perception is reality, right? So like my reality is determined by how I perceive the world, which might be different from your reality. So there's not like one objective truth, but we can at least find where the source of the information is coming from and understand to determine like, why am I seeing this now? Why am I seeing this in this way? And what does it mean to me?
Yeah, I guess I would say or encourage. I just always encourage, being able to tell your own stories. When we're talking about like power and data, a part of my work is meant to kind of emphasize that idea as well. So whether it's stories or data or however you want to categorize it, for the artist out there, do not get discouraged. Every time you make a new work, you're making your archive, you're making data, you're creating, a lens through which people can see things. And so, just words of inspiration, but to think about the validity of what you're doing every time, you contribute to the culture. That's very important. And just being thoughtful, the same way that you think about data and privacy and, concerns and who's managing the data and all that kind of stuff, think about yourself and representation, in the same way, and that you have the power to take even your own image and, remix it or destroy it. If somebody's, putting your image out in a way that you don't agree with, or, whatever. You can do that with your data, do that with your art, and, just keep making, at the end of the day, create more data, or else somebody else will create data for you, right?
Yeah, we end every show that we do with three things. This is our little saying. Number one, life is good. Number two, time is precious. And number three, make somebody smile, because that's beautiful. And I think the way that this relates to what you come across, on the internet or in looking at data sets is life is good. So, be objective. Take what you need from whatever it is that you're looking at that feeds you, that gives you value, and keep that with you and leave the rest for other folks to do the same. I think, time is precious, so maybe try not to get too far in the weeds about the stuff that you're looking at. If it's good, cool. If it's not, move on, I think to that point earlier, objectivity is one of those things that's kind of very quickly going, I don't want to say away, that's terrible, but it is what it is. Which is interesting. Videography is a big part of my gig as well, and immediately once we got in the room with people, I tried to be as objective as possible, which is, I guess, in common with what he was saying about being objective in his work, which is interesting. It just kind of popped in my head. But anyway, make somebody smile, because that's tight. And when I say that, I think, to your point, be conscious about what it is that you're doing and how you inject data into the larger data set, if you will, and how you use the tools around it to express yourself or talk about others or whatever it is that you're doing in the world. I think it's important that we keep a positive mindset and try and create things that are good and, live in that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. All of you, I'm just going to say the same thing that everyone else has said, except in different words. I think, to me, the important thing is to recognize that questioning objectivity does not mean a descent into relativism, where everything is accorded equal weight and equal truth in the world. I think when we're saying, what is objectivity, to me, the better goal or the better articulation of that is to be saying, what we all are seeking is sort of more truthful knowledge. And if that is our goal, which I think is legitimately one that hopefully everyone shares, then how we get there is never by a single objective perspective. It's by bringing together all these multiple perspectives, by figuring out how we can layer in additional forms of knowledge, and we can arrive at this sort of more composite whole, because we're always learning more. We're always sort of adding things that make our vision a little bit more complicated, a little bit more interesting. And I think what we personally believe to be more accurate, a more truthful perception of the world. And so to me, that's the real takeaway. It's not to reject this possibility, or reject the possibility that we can ever know anything to be true. It's that our methods might need to change and our perspective might need to expand a little bit.
I want to offer a really huge thank you to every panelist here for their grace, their truth that they're offering here, the Atlanta Interdisciplinary AI Network, Data and Society, and especially to each of you for coming for a very roundabout, rollicking talk this afternoon. Thank you so much. Our speakers will be hanging out afterwards. We're going to come down here. If you want to ask anyone a question, come on, give them a kudos, feel free. And a special thank you to Anuli for being the real engine behind this. So thank you all, and have a good night.